How's it going, folks? So originally this video was meant to release back in the early part of 2024, but because I had a pretty major move coming up, I had to unfortunately take this video and put it on the back burner while I prepared for that. While it may be kind of late by now, in this video I'm going to be discussing some of the best cards that were printed in 2023. Essentially, I'm going to take a handful of cards from every major set released last year and kind of discuss their impacts on most of the 60 card formats, with a bigger emphasis on Standard, Pioneer, and Modern, since those are the formats I'm familiar with. I'm only going to be discussing new cards that were printed in 2023, so reprints within sets or reprints from Secret Lairs are not going to be included in the video. I'm also not going to be including any cards that were printed in Dominaria Remastered, Commander Masters, or the Arena re-releases of Shadows over Innistrad or Khans of Tarkir, because most of those are reprint sets, and any of the new cards that came from Commander Masters are pretty much Commander exclusive. While we're on the topic of Commander, I am not going to be discussing Commander whatsoever in this video. This is exclusively going to be for 60 card formats. If you do want to see a video in the future where I talk about the best Commanders and Commander cards from 2023, go ahead and leave those comments down below. If there's enough interest, I'll get it done. So with all that preamble out of the way, take it away, voiceover me. Let's begin our discussion at the beginning of the year with the release of Phyrexia, All Will Be One in February. This expansion marked the first proper return to New Phyrexia, previously known as Mirrodin, since 2011's New Phyrexia set, and as such, it had some pretty big shoes to fill. Many longtime players anxiously winced at the return of poison counters, but Toxic, the fixed version of Infect, ended up playing pretty well and leading to much less explosively quick games. The first card I want to highlight from one is one of the Toxic cards itself, and that card is Venerated Rot Priest. When All Will Be One was being spoiled, many players hyped this card up as the much needed steroid that Infect players needed to make a comeback in the post-MH2 Modern format. I will admit, the Infect players did manage to put up a good fight for about a month. But try as they might, the deck still proved no match for the Murktides, Scams, and Footfalls of the world, and the Infect hype slowly fizzled out after release. So, if Infect was deemed a failure, why do I still want to talk about the Rot Priest? Well, its printing did create a fringe standard archetype that continues to be underrated today, in my humble opinion. Affectionately nicknamed Poison Ivy thanks to the addition of Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief, this Simic Prowess type deck would use the Phyrexian Druid to target its own creatures over and over again, protecting the creatures while racking up a lethal dose of 10 poison counters. In fact, I even played this deck earlier in the year for a Midweek Magic video on my channel, and the deck was absolutely one of my best performers all year with a very swift 3-0. While the meta version of this deck has shifted into a Bant aggro deck that makes use of White's many toxic creatures, Rot Priest is still an essential value engine that makes the deck as potent as it is. The next card isn't quite as flashy as Venerated Rot Priest, but it's undoubtedly had a major impact on multiple formats since its release, and that card is Sheoldred's Edict. Sacrifice effects, typically referred to as edicts in Magic lingo, often benefit your opponent because they get to choose to remove the least impactful permanent on the board. Sure, they're excellent answers to singular threats or creatures with hexproof, but they get absolutely curb stomped by even a singular spare creature token lying around. Sheoldred's Edict, on the other hand, lessens the negatives of typical Edict effects by giving you versatility in your targets. By being able to choose between non-token creature, creature token, and planeswalker, you shrink the pool of sackable permanents and force your opponents into really bad positions. In fact, you're almost guaranteed to eliminate the exact card you want, especially in the early game with very few permanents lying around. Another sneaky benefit to Sheoldred's Edict is that it actually affects each opponent. Yes, that means that it's pretty good in multiplayer formats, but notably, it avoids targeting a player. This means that it can bypass player hexproof abilities like Leyline of Sanctity that would normally protect against it. The combination of these factors has led it to become a staple removal spell of many 1v1 formats. It's nearly universally run in the black-based mid-range decks of Standard, Pioneer, and Historic. Many black control decks like Coffers use it in Modern, and it's even secured a slot in the Up the Beanstalk control deck in Legacy. Upgraded kill spells aren't the flashiest of new cards, but when the card's as effective as Sheoldred's Edict, you've gotta mention it on a list like this. The last All Will Be One card I want to mention, and the one whose name you've probably been screaming at your screen for the past few minutes, is Atraxa Grand Unifier. The second iteration of the 4-color Phyrexian Angel has all the keywords you remember from the original, but now enters the battlefield and digs 10 cards deep to refill your hand with one card of each type. Notoriously underrated during spoiler season, Atraxa quickly took over every format in the game as the premier reanimation target. Even Legacy and Vintage players who previously cheated out early turn Grizzlebrands started singing the praise of the Eldritch Mommy and sealed away their contractually obligated Demon Lords back into the Hell Vault. Aside from refilling your hand, a 7/7 with Flying, Vigilance, Lifelink, and Death Touch also makes for an incredibly fast clock of a win condition in plenty of decks. While Reanimator decks have fallen off in Standard lately, Atraxa is the primary reanimation target for all the holdout players and acts as the top end of the 5-color domain deck. In Pioneer, she can be cheated out as early as turn 3 with Delve creatures in Neo form, and she becomes extra powerful in the older Eternal formats. Because she's a 4-color creature, she can be pitched to cards like the Evoke Elementals, Force of Will, and Force of Negation, so she continues to see play in Modern and Legacy Goryo's Vengeance lists. Even as far back as Vintage, she's one of the many fetchable targets in the Oath of Druids deck. Atraxa is arguably the very best card printed in 2023, but it's still pretty early in the year. Let's see what the following releases have in store for us. April was a highly anticipated month for Magic the Gathering fans because we would finally receive the set that would culminate the new Phyrexia storyline that started back in 2021's Kaldheim. Gatewatch March of the Machine, don't know what that was about, was hyped up to be an interplanar epic that would see beloved characters from across the multiverse battle the invading Phyrexians, or in some cases join them. With this release came the introduction of the first new card type since 2006's Lorwyn. Battles were an interesting innovation in the combat step that would weigh attacking your opponent directly versus sending in some of your resources to flip over the payoff on the back. The first card I want to discuss from this set is actually one of those battle cards, Invasion of Gobakon. On the front side, a 2-mana white stacks piece that delays an oncoming threat for 2 turns is pretty reasonable. Having 3 defense counters means it doesn't take much of an investment to flip over, and the payoff is pretty damn good. Light Shield Array can be cast once the final defense counter is removed, and it gives 1/1 counters to each creature that attacks on each of your turns. You can also sacrifice it for free at any time to give your creatures hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, which gives the enchantment a versatile emergency button when facing an incoming board wipe. While the battle's viability has yet to escape Standard, the number of decks that can make use out of it is absolutely staggering. It's basically a white Thoughtseize in the early game and can be played in a mid-range shell, and go-wide token decks that run Virtue of Loyalty want the extra effect to grow their attackers turn after turn. The Selesnya Artifact Aggro +1/+1 counters deck makes excellent use out of it in conjunction with Ozolith the Shattered Spire, and because of how casting the backside of battles works, decks using Pia Nalaar Consul of Revival want this card as well. We are far away from seeing the full scope of this card's power, and that's pretty much all you could ask for from a brand new card design in 2023. Shifting gears for a moment, our next card is the perfect answer to the very go-wide decks that just got buffed. As far as board wipes go, White Sweeper Sunfall is among the best cards printed in recent memory. A 5-mana exile-based wrath that circumvents hexproof, protection, and indestructible is incredibly powerful and hard to work around. And you even get left with an incubator token with a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that you eliminate. Then, whenever you just have 2 extra mana floating around, you can flip that token over and start swinging with an enormous beat stick. In recent months, the Standard format has been warped around both Sunfall and its older brother Farewell. White midrange and control decks both love this effect as a way to impede the few aggro decks left in the format, and you can almost always expect a reset of the board on turn 5. With the longer Standard lifecycle implemented this year, Sunfall still has another 2 years to wreak havoc on Standard, and I'm sure we haven't even seen the height of this card's power yet. Is it as strong as Farewell? Arguably not, but it's definitely cemented a spot until it rotates or gets banned in the future. As far as multi-format threats go, you won't get any stronger than the Menace of Mom, Etali Primal Conqueror. Partly a tease towards the future Ixalan expansion, partly a marker of the Phyrexian's power, Etali's second printing has become an enormous monster to deal with in every format that makes use of it. When it ETBs, it basically comes with 2 free spells stapled onto it, which can either drop some of your opponent's threats on the spot or grow your board into an even bigger threat. It's also tremendously difficult to get rid of without a kill spell, as its massive 7/7 trampling body can make quick work of life totals. Much like Atraxa before it, Etali has become one of the most sought after creatures to either reanimate or ramp into early. Standard saw a Rakdos-based Reanimator mill deck emerge based on copying Breach the Multiverses with Chandra Hope's Beacon to hit Etali's, which would hopefully lead into more Breaches and more Etali's. And did I mention that it flips into a Blightsteel Colossus for 10 mana? Probably not, because you'll be destroyed long before it even gets that far. Overall, March of the Machine may have not impacted much further than Standard, but the cards that it did bring to Standard have definitely shaken the meta up pretty heavily. In one of the more bizarre experiments of the year, Wizards released March of the Machine The Aftermath about a month later. Marketed as a 50-card micro set to tie up loose ends following March of the Machine, this product was deemed an absolute failure by the wider community. This epilogue product was supposed to wrap up some character storylines following the Phyrexian invasion of the multiverse, but instead, it opened up far more questions than it was trying to answer. Coupled with the lore implications of Nahiri overcoming Phyresis by getting a concussion, yeah, this set was half-baked long before it was spoiled. Aftermath didn't provide many good new cards for 60-card formats, but one of my favorites so far is Pia Nalaar Consul of Revival. Chandra's mother gets her 3rd iteration as the new Kaladeshi Consul, leading the charge of returning the plane to its pre-invasion glory. Gameplay-wise, she's an excellent haste-enabling token generator that rewards you for playing cards from exile, only helped by the fact that these impulse draw effects are becoming more and more commonplace. Ren's Resolve just joined Rob the Archives and Reckless Impulse, plus removal spells like Nahiri's Warcrafting look to be coming together for Pia rather nicely. Admittedly, it did take quite a while for Pia to catch on in Standard, but the addition of the adventure cards from Wilds of Eldraine gave her a lot more versatile cards to cast from exile like Questing Druid and Virtue of Loyalty. Then she got turbocharged even further with the Discover mechanic from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, making cards like Geological Appraiser and Quintorius Cond into serious game-ending threats. As more and more time goes on, I think the future is going to look even brighter for Pia's Standard viability. The first of the Despark Planeswalkers to make this list, Calyx Guided by Fate was another slam dunk design for Standard. It's kinda difficult to make a proper Enchantress deck viable in Standard unless a set within the format heavily pushes enchantments, like when we get to visit Theros for example. But in losing his ability to travel the multiverse, Calyx gained an incredibly powerful enchantment cloning ability on top of a consolation trigger that distributes +1/+1 counters. While it isn't on the top of the Standard metagame by any means, Selesnya Enchantments has been revitalized thanks to the enormous boost that Calyx provides. Considering some of the best value engines and removal spells in Standard are enchantments, being able to bang multiple copies of these insane powerhouses means that Calyx steamrolls unless he's dealt with immediately. For anyone who enjoyed Neon Dynasty's limited environment, it's about time that you dust off your Jukai Naturalists, Generous Visitors, and Commies of Transients to take this stompy deck to the next level. Finally, much to the surprise of many players, Eternal Magic got a great new value engine in the form of Nissa Resurgent Animist. A Lotus Cobra that costs an extra mana is kind of underwhelming, but it's the second landfall trigger that makes her worth playing in the 4-color money pile decks. Nissa will reveal cards from your library until you hit either an elf or an elemental and put that card into your hand. And you want to know what some of the best creatures in Modern are? The Evoke Elementals and Omnath Locus of Creation, that's what. And with the raw power of fetch lands and their ability to trigger landfall twice, you basically just get rewarded for playing the lands that you would normally play anyways. In recent months, the 4-color Omnath piles have taken a backseat thanks to the banning of Up the Beanstalk and Fury in Modern. But don't let that take away from the utter dominance of the deck going into the summer. Outside of Modern, Nissa continues to see fringe play in Pioneer Elementals and Fires of Invention decks, but she's nowhere near the crowning jewel of those decks in the same way. Aftermath was a pretty small set, and I've pretty much named all the cards that actually saw play. Well, hopefully the next set will be better. Taking a step back from the MTG canon, we move along to the first tentpole release to feature a non-Magic IP. Magic the Gathering, Universes Beyond, The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. Ugh, Jesus. Would release in June to much hype from the community at large. Rather than the cool new card designs inspired by the iconic fantasy series, most of the attention surrounding this set came from the serialized One of One, the One Ring card. The hunt for this one-of-a-kind collectible would cause this set to become the best-selling MTG expansion of all time, with even people outside of the community rushing to crack collector boosters to find this life-changing piece of cardboard. In the end, it was finally found at Face-to-Face Games in Toronto and sold to Post Malone for $2 million US, which is about like 20 billion Canadian dollars. Anyways, back on topic. MTG x LOTR gave us plenty of new designs for Modern and beyond, and among the more unique designs was the Nazgul. We've seen plenty of cards that break the 4 of playset rule in the past, but these wraiths really stood out as some of the most powerful that we've ever seen. The Ring Tempts You is one of the most intricate and complex mechanics ever made for Magic, and the 9 Nazguls took advantage of this effect by stacking on top of each other to create a tidal wave of value. They're difficult to swing into because of Death Touch, and as you play more and more of them, they give more and more +1 counters to each other. While the Nazguls never really took off in many paper formats, digital Magic in the form of Arena was littered with these little freaks of nature. For some reason, they decided to let these cards designed for Modern be historic and alchemy legal, leading to months of mono black decks packed to the brim with Sheoldreds, Nazguls, One Rings, and Orcish Bowmasters until the deck finally received a nerf in September. I'm grateful that I don't run into these menaces much anymore, because sometimes they're impossible to efficiently deal with. The Nazguls were the least of the problems when it came to LTR. 2 incredibly powerful and iconic cards spawned from this release, and they've affected just about every format they're legal in. Those cards, of course, are Orcish Bowmasters and the One Ring. Honestly, like, do I have to analyze these? Like, anybody who's played Magic in the last 6 months knows how absurd these things are. Orcish Bowmasters is an insane card draw punishing effect that creates 2 bodies and deals direct damage each time it triggers. The fact that this ability is also an ETB trigger means that any creature with 1 toughness is basically banned from the format unless they're too powerful not to play. On the other hand, the One Ring is the most busted card draw engine the game has ever seen. Yeah, you accumulate damage the longer that it stays on the battlefield, but picture this. It's hardly even an issue when you draw 10 cards over the span of 4 turns and only take 6 damage for it. By that point, you should have found just about everything that you need to win anyways. Both of these cards have either become staples of the formats that they see play in, or they've been banned or alchemized. No debates here, so let's just move on. After that Tolkien-flavored sidestep, the next major standard legal expansion would take us back to the European fairy tale-inspired world of Eldraine. Wilds of Eldraine was released in early September, and being the first expansion to delve into the consequences of the Phyrexian invasion, there were a lot of questions surrounding what changed since our last visit. Turns out, not too much really, just some people are in a permanent sleep? Okay then. Well, this development for the plane of Eldraine did lead to one of my favorite new standard cards this year, Sleep Cursed Fae. The return of fairies on Eldraine, coupled with the previous outliers like Halo Forager and Fairy Mastermind, seemed to create a clear indicator that Fairy Kindred decks would make their grand return to standard. Many older Magic players remembered the days of Lorwyn Block back when Thoughtseize, Bitter Blossom, and Spellstarter Sprite all managed to see play in the same deck, fearing that this would become the outcome for WoW Standard as well. Turns out, no, not really. Like, it's fine, but it doesn't really compete with those old cards. Stun counters were a new addition in 2022's Dominaria United that never really caught on, but Sleep Cursed Fae handles them in a fun and pretty unique way. It plays like a delayed Delver of Secrets, but the trickiness of the Fairies deck makes its activated ability a versatile mana sink. You can leave up some mana for a Go for the Throat, maybe a Fairy Mastermind, or just bluff that you have something and make it untap quicker than normal. Ward 2 and the 3/3 body also mean that it doesn't immediately die to a turn 1 cut down or most 2 mana removal, so you'll get to keep it around longer than most 1-drop creatures. Once the stun counters are removed, you can also use its activated ability to give it pseudo vigilance, allowing it to hit with evasion and leave a decent blocker on defense. The next heavy hitter from Eldraine wasn't hyped up that much during pre-release, but really shined once in the player's hands. Questing Druid is a surprising all-star to come out of the set, but it turns out that stapling instant speed impulse draw effects to Aquarian Dryad really makes for a strong tempo engine. As mentioned earlier, this card was a key component of the Niopian Alar Exile deck that started to pick up steam around this time, and Gruul aggro decks in Standard started to use it as a card draw engine, a prowess trigger for Monastery Swiftsphere, and a decently sized beater on later turns. In fact, I didn't even realize the full extent of Questing Druid's power before researching for this video. Turns out, it's seen play as far back as Legacy in the top tier Temur Delver deck. Even without the green splash, Izzet prowess decks in Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy are also making very good use of the Seek the Beast adventure. Some Jund Saga decks also make use of the Dryad alongside fellow adventure spell Mosswood Dread Knight, who was very close to making this list as well, but unfortunately there's only room for one other bonkers card from Eldraine, and that needs to be discussed. While the lifespan of Up the Beanstalk was cut short with its modern banning, the 2-mana enchantment continues to compete with the One Ring for the top card draw engine in competitive Magic. This swift ban came about due to the interaction with, you guessed it, the Evoke Elementals, specifically Solitude and Fury. They can be cast for free by pitching a card of their respective color, but you just get the card back for casting the elemental anyway. Turning some of Modern's most busted mistakes into no downside removal machines was considered far too powerful for a reason after all. Even without its future play in Modern, Up the Beanstalk still has a very long lifespan ahead of it in other formats. It's a staple of the standard domain deck, making Leyline Binding a 1-mana removal spell that draws you a card. Yeah, that's pretty nuts. Also mentioned earlier was the Beanstalk control deck in Legacy, which gains additional uses from the beans by casting cheap Murktide Regents and free Force of Wills. Even though it took the fall for the mistakes of the Evoke Elementals, Up the Beanstalk will continue to be a pushed and powerful card for many years to come. The next set to release after was another step out of the Magic pond and back into Universes Beyond with the Doctor Who Commander decks. While I want to acknowledge this October release for completion's sake, there isn't too much to talk about in regards to powerful new constructed legal cards. Being a Commander product, this expansion is only legal in Legacy and Vintage, 2 formats of which I have next to no knowledge. The cards were also designed with multiplayer gameplay in mind, and some of them even explicitly mention the Planeswalk mechanic that is exclusive to the casual Planechase variant. Let's just say that the Brits aren't really breaking picking Legacy and Vintage apart. I do want to mention one card with enormous potential in Magic's strongest formats, and that's Everybody Lives. Aside from being one of the few cards in the game's history with an exclamation mark in its title, this card is an enormous combo killer that, among other things, prevents players from winning the game until end of turn. In a format where Doomsday, Thoracle, and Storm are all potential win conditions, having a way to fizzle these game enders for 2 mana in white is incredibly valuable. Not many decks seem to be running the cards since Legacy has shifted towards a more mid-range tempo metagame, but this card is very well positioned to become a staple in the event of a combo uprising. The last stop on the 2023 Carnival ride was a return to one of Magic's most beloved planes in recent years. The Lost Caverns of Ixalan stomped its way into existence in November, and while we've only had a month or two to give these cards a fair shot, LCI has given us some major bangers already. The 4 tribal groups that you love from the original Ixalan block are back, this time journeying into the center of the earth Brendan Fraser style. And they've been busting up formats along the way with the new fixed version of Cascade, Discover. Speaking of Discover, let's just cut to the chase. This mechanic is stupid busted and constructed. Case in point, Geological Appraiser had to be banned just 17 days after the set's release, one of the fastest bannings in the game's history, because of a broken combo deck in Pioneer. You just have to resolve one Appraiser and then cascade into clones and keep cascading over and over again, eventually hitting Eldritch Evolutions to turn them into Trumpeting Carnosaurs, and then keep cascading until you hit a haste enabler like Doomscar Giant. With a Creative Outburst or a Magma Opus and a Cavern of Souls, this basically turned into a 3-turn instant win combo deck that was fast even by modern standards. Now that the big bad combo has been eviscerated, the Appraiser still sees its fair share of play in plenty of other formats, where it takes on a more mid-range value role as it was probably intended. Standard decks like Rakdos Midrange run it as a 2-for-1, its Discover trigger benefits the Nayapia list, and it continues to drive the Discover combo in both historic and modern. You know, where it isn't banned. As for standard impact, my favorite new addition to the roster has got to be Inti Seneschal of the Sun. Originally previewed as a rather unimpressive mono-red commander pick, people really seem to have latched onto the raw power of his attack trigger. He has a lot of flexibility by throwing cards into the graveyard and impulse drawing another card for you to use later in the turn, especially in a color like red that struggles with card advantage. I'm sure you're probably seeing a pattern with all the exile-based cards I've been mentioning, but Nayapia has become the de facto home for Huatli's cousin, along with his role in the aforementioned Rakdos midrange deck. Speaking of Rakdos, he's even becoming an occasional choice for Rakdos midrange and Rakdos Sacrifice in Pioneer, along with a bunch of other +1/+1 counter aggro decks. The Dino Rider's diverse roles are only beginning to emerge as Ixalan gets figured out, and I can't wait to see where he goes from here. The final pick of both LCI and the video is going to be the most hyped card in the set, the Stifle on a Body itself, Tishana's Tidebinder. Players have had their eyes on this nasty merfolk from the moment that it was spoiled, and judging on the rise in its price, I can only imagine how effective it can be. Stifling an activated or triggered ability can be brutal enough on its own, but shutting that permanent off for as long as you control the Tidebinder is a new level of rubbing it in your face that we don't see all that often on hate bears nowadays. The merfolk does see a bit of standard play, mostly in the Esper midrange deck, but the primary home for this nasty fish has been modern. Temur Rhinos has successfully integrated it as part of its 3+ mana value control package, and decks from Murktide to 4-color Omnath to Death Shadow are looking to take advantage of that sick ETB trigger. Of course, being a merfolk, players will continue to try to make it work in the merfolk tribal deck, but there will have to be a huge shift in the meta for those days to return once again. For Magic's newest expansion at the time of writing, I'm very excited to see where these cards and this set will land by this time next year. So those were a handful of cards from each major release that I wanted to reminisce over. If you liked this video and you want to see more just like it, it would be a huge help if you could tap the like button down below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button along with the bell icon to get alerted whenever new videos release. Until next time, take care.